Good day. How are you, Dr. Sutherland? How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Talia. How are you?
I am wonderful. I'm so
Good.
excited that you are here. Um, and to our listening audience, my name is Talia Ashley. I am the Communications and Marketing Coordinator for Richmont Graduate University. And we have the pleasure of sitting here with Dr. Sonja Sutherland, one of our associate professors and our Dean of Assessment Planning and Accreditation, and our inaugural director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion.
That's the most exciting one to me.
Yes, it is momentous. It is definitely a wonderful feat for Richmont. It's our newest edition. We're just so glad, and we could not be more happy that you are, of course, our new inaugural director.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. So with that being said, what we are going to do now, we are featuring you as our Faculty Spotlight for our giving season, our holiday season. Again, we're very happy. And so we'd like to ask you a couple of questions in that regard.
Sure.
Okay, wonderful. So to lead off, historically, the BIPOC or Black and Indigenous people of color community has struggled with the stigma related to mental health counseling. This struggle seems to be lifting within the BIPOC community such that mental health counseling seems to be accepted. Do you agree or disagree?
Well, I think that's twofold. Certainly there are pockets within the BIPOC community where I do believe the stigma of mental health is not as prevalent. I think that's probably due to a lot of different factors. It can be maybe increases in socioeconomic status, just changes generationally, the gradual increase in the number of BIPOC counselors that are available for people of color to go to. I think those are probably some influencers of the stigma starting to dissipate. Overall, though, I believe that there has been as significant a dissipation as we would like to see in terms of that stigma around mental health support. I think the entrenchment of that stigma can really be attributed to probably the strength of some of the primary associations that counseling has had with social service institutions. I think decades ago, unfortunately, the introduction of mental health services within the BIPOC community was often linked to a family's involvement in social service systems, right, that mandated counseling as part of the overall intervention. And so there was a connected distrust of what people may have seen as structurally racist institutions, right? And so social services organizations were then connected with counseling, and that distrust developed. And I think then too, that was compounded by the lack of BIPOC counselors at that time. And so being forced to engage with white mental health professionals who were historically quick to diagnose and medicate severe mental illness, while also, I think, denying people's experiences of the impact of racism. And I think that justified that lack of trust. So there's been a shift, in the last 30, 40 years, there's been a shift in the realities of that dynamic, but it is still there. I think back to my days in psychiatric residential where I worked with BIPOC children and teens, and that was just maybe 5-6 years ago. And that distrust is still there. That pushback was still there at that time. And so it's not dissipated, but it has shifted a little bit. And I think too, we can't ignore the health and racial pandemics this year that really do highlight the pervasiveness of what are life-threatening situations that are systemic in nature, not just interpersonal racism, right? Across a lot of different experiences for BIPOC individuals. So all of that, I think, contributes to the ongoing mistrust, and it extends itself to the mental health field, unfortunately.
I understand. I have a follow-up question. You kind of hinted on it. Despite the fact that this year has definitely been challenging for many in the BIPOC community in terms of the pandemic and the racial injustice that we have seen, I know that you're stating that there has been a shift. Do you think that it may, that this shift may continue as a result of it being highlighted in terms of the mental health conditions of our nation and our global situations thus far? Do you think it will continue to, Or do you think it's even, I don't want to use the word help or supported the fact that mental health counseling is needed? I don't know if I'm phrasing the question properly.
I think I understand what you're asking. You're asking, given what has transpired this year and the highlighted need for mental health services because of all that's been occurring, do I think that will shift? And yeah, I do. I think it will be slow. I think there are pockets of people in the BIPOC community who are still waiting to see how things play out. At the same time, there is a heightened awareness, and so counselors of the dominant culture are, in many respects, seeking to become more culturally competent and more able to intervene with diverse individuals more so than historically because of the awareness. More and more counselors of color are being trained. And so while certainly there is still a disproportionate number, I think that over time, all of this will contribute to the ongoing dissipation. I think it's coming. It's definitely shifting.
Okay. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. It's a great lead into our second question. In 2020, racial injustice against members of the BIPOC community at the hands of police officers and others peaked at unforeseen highs. These injustices caused widespread tension across the nation and negative attention across the globe. What have you seen as the impact on individuals of diverse racial and cultural backgrounds as they have been exposed to racial discrimination in the media?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's probably most accurate to say that rather than it's peaked this year, I think that racial injustice has just become more obvious to many within the dominant culture, such that there's no way to deny its reality or continue to pretend or be unaware, right? What became more visible because of the media is not new. It's always been the case, and folks in the BIPOC community have known that. In reality, what people saw on television too was only a fraction of all the cases that occurred this year, right? Only a few of the more sensationalized incidents were highlighted. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. Right? And as time has passed, we've seen even a decrease in media coverage about what's going on and what is the pervasive reality for BIPOC individuals. Nonetheless, I agree with you that the increased visibility of the realities of police brutality through the media that we saw this year was indeed traumatic for everyone and influenced an unprecedented and widespread tension for many in our country and across the globe, as you said. And I think that tension is more than warranted. And then at the same time, I think the experience of anxiety, of depression, burnout from the cumulative exposure to racial discrimination via the media has more to do than just police brutality. And how people manage the emotional and the psychological toll of all of these cumulative exposures can really be complicated, and it can take time to understand it and to manage it, and it will look different, really, depending on where you sit at the table of injustice, I think. So, for example, for some, their experiences of, let's just say, anxiety, depression, or other traumatic stress responses are related to being repeatedly faced with realities that they would prefer not be true, right? For many of these types of people, it's a jarring of their concept of the world. For some, it's like a dismantling of what they have been taught was true, but now seems to be otherwise. And I think rather than avoiding the impact of that, I think they're being pressed instead to confront the answers to questions like, how can this really be true? Or why didn't I know this? Or what does this mean about me? Or what does this mean I'm supposed to do? Right? And for people who choose to pursue that type of truth, they will need to be ready to consider all of the distressing and potentially unmooring answers, I think, to questions like that and all the questions in between those questions, right?
Exactly, I agree.
Yeah. And then still for others of us who have known these truths all along, as evidenced by our own life experiences, our realities go beyond anxiety and depression to a whole lot more chronic experience of lifelong complex trauma, right? And a lot of times in our community, we talk about that as being racial battle fatigue, right? So more than witnessing just these racial injustices in 2020 that have been sensationalized by the media, racial battle fatigue really represents that accumulation of our repeated lifelong exposure, right, to interpersonal and structural microaggressions. And racial battle fatigue, that term just describes that psychological toll, that physiological and behavioral strain that we experience because of all the energy that we have to expend within the BIPOC community, fighting against daily interaction with racism in our lives. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had in the last few months as our nation has experienced the political war playing out within our country. For everyone connected with me who are members of the BIPOC community, psychological strain for them, for me, has been tremendous, right? And that polarization that was driven by all of our political leaders, it was really severe. And a great deal of that polarization was characterized within racial and cultural messages that were demoralizing. And it had a negative effect, significantly so, on the emotional and psychological health of the BIPOC community. I think more than any other cultural demographic, right? So, yeah, I just think that a large majority, if any of those messages, were never really publicly, collectively, or demonstratively rebuked in any way by our elected officials, the ones that had the most power. And because of that, what was truly at stake was really that answer to the question that we've been hearing. Black Lives Matter, well, do we really matter, right?
Right.
Given all of that. So you can see how the suffering is different for different people, and the reasons for their anxiety or depression, traumatic stress is complex and it's different.
It is. I agree. As a member of the BIPOC community, I definitely concur with everything you're saying. And I think the part that that many of us become equally concerned about is the fact that it becomes, as we say as many of us say in our community, a generational curse.
Yes.
You know, it becomes for lack of a better phrase, a lifestyle. You learn to live with it, and perhaps as a result don't recognize it as what I'm thinking you might be saying in part as PTSD. You know, it's just unfortunately what many of us learn to accept as rolling with the punches.
Yeah.
And of course, you know better than I, or just as much, it's not healthy.
Yeah. And I think for most of us in the BIPOC community, while what we experience may not rise to the level of post-traumatic stress disorder, definitely traumatic stress, acute stress symptomology will be there. And it does require intervention. Again, these are cumulative experiences. And generationally, you're right on point to talk about it generationally, because it is, in fact, compounded trauma, generation through generation. And I think most people don't really realize the layering effect that all of the experiences of trauma that people from BIPOC communities experience generationally really do influence how we respond, what we expect, how we experience the world, how our body physiologically responds to racial trauma, how cognitively we think about, how our emotions play out. Very much connected, very much connected. It's a deep phenomenon. Generational trauma is real, and it is a deep phenomenon.
Wow. So as we are experiencing this holiday season, perhaps we can all, or many of us, should possibly seek health support in terms of mental health, family
Absolutely.
Support, that kind
Absolutely.
of just hug on each other a bit more.
Yeah. And you know, in the BIPOC communities, we rely on each other a lot. A lot of our emotional and psychological support does come from family, comes from religious, spiritual connections. It comes from community, right? Historically, that's what it's been. In addition to that, I think it's really important for folks to seek out mental health counseling because, as we talked about, it is trauma, right? And it is generational, and it takes more than community and spirituality. Those are necessary, and in addition, I think that working with a counselor can bring a lot of benefit and relief to the experiences and the impact that these have on our daily lives.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sutherland. It's always a pleasure talking to you. I learned so much from you. That's just okay.
So, it was a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me, Sonja.
Oh, you're welcome.